Homeless man is mocked at construction site until he teaches engineers how to save a building about to collapse. Robert Johnson woke up that Monday in March to the deafening noise of machines starting another workday at the construction site next to the overpass where he had slept for 3 years. His tired eyes watched through the fence as engineers in impeccable suits and white hard hats moved about, while he straightened the yellowed papers he religiously kept in a torn plastic bag. That's when he saw the first signs of the problem that had brought him there that morning. A subtle, almost imperceptible crack ran along the base of the third pillar of the structure, rising majestically in the heart of Chicago. Robert stood up slowly, his joints protesting against the early morning chill, and walked toward the construction gate with growing determination in his chest. "Hey, you there?" shouted the security guard, a burly man in a blue uniform. "Get out of here right now." Robert raised his hands, showing the papers he carried. His graying beard was unkempt, his brown shirt stained with dirt, and his worn-out shoes barely clung to his calloused feet. "I need to speak to the engineer in charge," he said in a hoarse but firm voice. "It's about the building's structure." The guard let out a harsh laugh. "An engineer? You must be joking, old man. Get lost before I call the cops." But Robert didn't move, his eyes fixed on the crack slowly spreading at the base of the pillar like an open wound in the still fresh concrete. "Can't you see?" he insisted, pointing at the structure. "That pillar is going to give way. The ground has an issue." The loud conversation caught the attention of Richard Wilson, the construction site's lead engineer, a heavy-set man of 45 with a perpetually irritated expression on his face. "What's all this noise, War?" he asked, striding toward the gate. "Just a homeless guy, Mr. Wilson," the guard explained. "Says he knows engineering." Richard looked Robert up and down, his face twisting with disdain. "Seriously?" he mocked, loud enough for the other engineers to hear. "Now bums are civil engineering experts?" Laughter echoed across the site. Jessica Davis, a young 23-year-old intern, watched from a distance with growing discomfort in her stomach. Robert took a deep breath and held out one of the papers through the fence. "Please, just look at this. These are calculations about the soil resistance in this area. I worked on this land 20 years ago." Richard took the paper with contempt, but his eyes widened as he saw the precise notes, the detailed technical drawings, the structural formulas handwritten in impeccable script. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice thick with suspicion. "I wrote it," Robert replied simply. "This land has a peculiarity underground, a water table that was improperly diverted when they built the mall next door in 2004. The water is eroding the foundation of the pillars." Richard crumpled the paper and threw it on the ground. "Listen here, you lunatic. I don't know where you stole these drawings, but I'm not wasting my time on some bum who doesn't even have a place to sleep. Security, get him out of here." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now back to the story. Robert was pushed away from the gate, but he didn't give up. He returned the next day and the day after that, always with the same papers, always with the same urgent warning. The crack in the pillar grew larger with each passing day. Jessica noticed that the man always appeared at the same time, studied the same points on the structure, and took notes in a battered notebook. His curiosity got the better of him when, on Wednesday, he drew a detailed schematic on the cardboard he used as a surface, showing exactly how water was seeping into the foundations. "Dr. Richard," Jessica called, approaching her boss hesitantly. "That man, his calculations seem incredibly precise." Richard stopped reviewing the blueprints and stared at her with disbelief. "Jessica, are you seriously suggesting we take a homeless man at his word?" "That's not what I mean, it's just..." She hesitated but pressed on. "He knows technical details only someone with training would understand. And the crack he mentioned actually appeared exactly where he said it would." "Coincidence," Richard dismissed with a wave of his hand. "And if I find out you're wasting time on this nonsense instead of working, you'll be looking for another place to intern." By Thursday, things took a drastic turn. During the concrete pour for the 5th floor, one of the beams began cracking, the fissures spreading like spiderwebs through the still wet concrete. The engineer in charge of the section, Michael Cooper, turned pale at the sight. "Richard, you need to see this up here," he radioed, his voice tense. Richard rushed upstairs, followed by the entire technical team. What they saw left them speechless. The cracks weren't just spreading, they were following a pattern that matched exactly what Robert had sketched days earlier. "How is this possible?" Michael murmured. "We triple-checked all the calculations." Richard looked down and saw Robert standing across the street, watching the commotion with genuine concern. For a moment their eyes met, and Richard felt a pang of something like remorse. "Everyone, back to work," he barked. "We'll handle this internally." But there was no internal fix. By Friday, 2 more beams showed the same instability. Richard fired 3 workers, blaming them for improperly mixed concrete, though deep down he knew that wasn't the issue. At lunch, Jessica crossed the street to talk to Robert, who was sitting on the sidewalk eating a sandwich someone had given him. "Excuse me," she said carefully. "I work at the site over there. Do you really know engineering?" Robert studied her for a moment, noting the sincerity in her young eyes. She was a pretty woman, her dark hair tied back in a ponytail, wearing a company jumpsuit that still smelled new. "I do," he replied calmly. "I graduated from the Illinois Institute of Technology in 1987, worked 15 years as a structural engineer before—" He paused, a shadow crossing his face. "Before everything fell apart." "What happened?" Jessica asked, sitting beside him on the curb. Robert was silent for a long moment, watching the foot traffic. "There was an accident," he finally said. "A building I designed had structural issues. No one was seriously hurt, but I took the blame for everything. Lost my license, my home, my family. Later, I found out it was a setup, but it was too late." Jessica's heart ached. There was something in Robert's voice, a deep pain echoing in his words. "And now you see the same thing happening here." "Worse," Robert sighed. "This site has a geological quirk few know about. There's an underground stream that shifted when they built the mall next door. The water's creating lateral pressure on the foundations. Eventually, the whole structure will give way. Can you prove it?" Robert opened his plastic bag and pulled out a worn yellowed envelope. Inside were the original site plans from 2004, bearing his signature as the engineer responsible for the soil study. "I conducted the original survey for this site," he said, showing the documents. "At the time, I recommended that any construction would need a specific drainage system to handle the diverted water table. It seems they didn't follow my advice." Jessica examined the papers with growing astonishment. Everything was there. Detailed soil analyses, water pressure projections, even a drainage system that could solve the problem. "I need to show this to my supervisor," she said, standing up quickly. "He won't believe you," Robert warned. "I've tried many times before. But now I have proof." Jessica smiled for the first time in days. "And if you really did the original study, your name should be in the city records." That afternoon, Jessica rushed to the municipal archives and spent hours searching for the original site documents. When she finally found them, her heart raced. There it was, the full name, Robert Johnson, civil engineer, PEIL 85-427, responsible for the environmental impact study and soil analysis of lot number 4567 on Michigan Avenue. She photocopied everything and hurried back to the construction site, where she found Richard Wilson in an animated discussion with James Thompson, the construction company owner. James was a polished man in his 60s, his silver hair perfectly groomed, who had come in person due to the mounting problems at the site. "Dr. Wilson, Dr. Thompson," Jessica interrupted, breathless. "I need to show you something very important." Richard looked at her with irritation. "Jessica, I told you I don't have time for—" "It's about the man who comes here every day," she insisted, handing over the documents. "He really is an engineer, and he did the original survey for this site." James took the papers and examined them carefully. His expression shifted gradually from impatience to curiosity, then to concern. "Richard," he said gravely, "why weren't these documents in our records?" Richard paled, nervously flipping through the original plans. "I don't know. We bought the project from an outside consultant. Jonathan Pierce said he had all the necessary studies." The name Jonathan Pierce made Robert flinch from across the street. It was the same man who had orchestrated his downfall years ago, the rival who had always envied his talent and found a way to ruin his career. "Bring that man here," James ordered. "Immediately." Half an hour later, Robert stood inside the trailer serving as the site office, surrounded by engineers and architects, watching him with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. His dirty clothes starkly contrasted with the clean, organized space, but his posture was upright and confident. "Sir?" James hesitated, realizing he didn't even know the man's name. "Robert Johnson," he introduced himself, extending his hand with dignity. James shook it, noting the firm grip despite his fragile appearance. "Mr. Johnson, I need you to explain exactly what problem you've identified in our structure." Robert walked to the table where the current project plans were spread out. His eyes traced the drawings with the precision of someone who knew every line, every measurement. "The problem began in 2004, he explained, tracing an imaginary line on the paper with his finger. "When they built the mall next door, they diverted an underground stream without installing the proper containment system. Since then, water has been slowly eroding the subsoil in this area." Richard crossed his arms, still resisting the idea of accepting the explanation. "Then, why is this only showing up now?" "Because you're building a 20-story tower," Robert replied patiently. "The weight of the structure is pressing down on soil already weakened by constant water seepage. The foundations weren't designed for this specific condition." James studied Robert's original blueprints side by side with the current project. "And what would the solution be?" "We need to install a deep drainage system before it's too late." Robert pointed to specific spots on the drawings. "And reinforce the foundations of columns 3, 7, and 11, the ones bearing the most lateral water pressure." Michael, the engineer who had first discovered the cracks, leaned over the table. "That makes sense," he admitted reluctantly. "The cracks appeared exactly on those columns." Richard felt his authority being challenged and reacted with hostility. "We're not stopping a $100 million project because of a bum's theories," he declared, slamming his hand on the table. "I can hire any structural consultant in the country who'll say everything's fine." "Richard," James scolded him sharply, "this man did the original soil study. He knows details even our current consultant didn't mention." The tension in the trailer was palpable. Jessica watched the argument with a heavy heart, hoping the truth would prevail. Robert remained calm, but inside he relived the same humiliations that had destroyed his life years earlier. "If you'll allow me," Robert said firmly, "I can do a more detailed analysis and present a specific action plan, at no cost." "And why would you do that?" Richard asked suspiciously. "What's in it for you?" Robert looked out the trailer window, watching the workers toiling tirelessly on the unstable structure. "Those men out there have families to support," he replied simply. "And the people who will work in this building deserve to know they're safe. Engineering isn't just calculations and formulas, it's responsibility." James was struck by the sincerity in Robert's voice. There was wisdom there, a maturity that came not just from technical training, but from a life lived with all its joys and sorrows. "All right," he decided. "You have 2 days to prepare a full report. Jessica, you'll assist him with whatever he needs." Richard stormed out of the trailer fuming, muttering about the insanity of trusting a homeless man. But James and the other engineers stayed, eager to hear more of Robert's observations. Over the next 48 hours, Robert worked day and night on the report. Jessica helped by getting him access to the site computers and lending him clean clothes from her brother. For the first time in years, Robert felt useful again, like he had a purpose. He settled into a small room on the ground floor of the admin building, spreading his old blueprints alongside the current plans. His fingers traced calculations with the precision of a conductor leading a symphony, each number finding its place in the grand equation. Jessica brought him coffee and sandwiches, and during breaks, they talked about engineering, life, and dreams lost and rediscovered. She learned Robert had been married, that he had a daughter who was now a doctor in another state and hadn't spoken to him in 5 years. "She believes I really committed the mistakes I was accused of," Robert confessed during one of these talks, his voice heavy with sorrow. "I could never prove my innocence. And why didn't you defend yourself back then?" "I tried," Robert sighed. But Jonathan Pierce planted false evidence, bribed witnesses, manipulated documents. He was too influential, had powerful connections. Against him, it was just the word of an ordinary engineer. Jessica felt a growing anger at the injustices Robert had endured. There was something deeply wrong with a system that allowed talent to be wasted and honesty to be punished. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now continuing. On Monday morning, Robert presented his report. 20 pages of detailed analysis, corrected blueprints, precise calculations, and an action plan that could not only save the current structure, but also prevent future problems. James studied each page with growing attention. Other engineers from the construction company were called in to review the work, and they all reached the same conclusion. The report was technically flawless. "It's brilliant," Michael admitted. "The level of detail is impressive. And financially viable," added another engineer, examining the estimated costs. "In fact, it's cheaper than redoing the foundations." Richard kept resisting, but his position was becoming untenable as more professionals validated Robert's work. "Very well," James decided. "We'll implement the plan. Richard, you'll coordinate the work alongside Mr. Johnson." "I won't work with a beggar," Richard finally snapped. "My professional reputation won't allow it." The silence that followed was awkward. James looked at Richard with a disappointment that cut deeper than any shout. "Your professional reputation," he said slowly, "should be based on competence and the humility to recognize talent wherever it is. If you can't do that, maybe it's time to rethink your position in this company." Richard realized he'd gone too far. His arrogance had backed him into a corner, and now he had to choose between his pride and his job. "Fine," he muttered through clenched teeth, "but let it be clear that this goes against my professional judgment." The implementation of Robert's plan began on Tuesday. He coordinated the teams with a natural authority that came from his deep understanding of every aspect of the project. The workers, initially skeptical, soon respected him for the clear and respectful way he explained each procedure. Frank Miller, the foreman, a 58-year-old man with 40 years of experience in construction, was the first to publicly acknowledge Robert's competence. "This man knows more about structure than most university doctors I've ever seen," he declared during a lunch break. "You all better pay attention to what he says." Jessica watched everything with a mix of admiration and anguish. She saw how Robert flourished when practicing his profession, how his eyes lit up when explaining a complex technical solution. But she also noticed the pain he carried, the deep scar left by years of humiliation and abandonment. The first weeks of work brought spectacular results. The deep drainage system was installed with surgical precision, and the problematic pillars received structural reinforcements calculated down to the millimeter. The cracks stopped growing and began to stabilize. Richard, despite his initial resistance, was forced to admit the plan was working. But his hostility toward Robert only changed form, becoming more subtle and dangerous. He began questioning every decision, creating bureaucratic obstacles, spreading doubts about the safety of the proposed solutions. "I'm not convinced this drainage will hold the weight of the full building," he remarked during a technical meeting. "What if the system fails when we're on the 15th floor?" Robert responded patiently, showing calculations that proved the system's safety, but he could tell Richard was trying to sabotage the project indirectly. The situation reached its breaking point one Thursday morning when Robert arrived at the construction site and discovered someone had altered the specifications for the concrete to be used in the structural reinforcements. The mixture had lower strength than calculated, which could compromise the entire structure. "Who authorized this change?" Robert asked, examining the material delivery notes. The supplier showed a document signed by Richard, claiming the adjustment was necessary for cost reasons. Jessica rushed to inform James, who arrived at the site visibly angry. When he confronted Richard about the unauthorized change, the response was evasive. "It was just a technical adjustment to optimize costs," Richard defended himself. "The difference in strength is minimal." "Minimal?" Robert intervened, pulling up the calculations on his laptop. "This change reduces the strength by 15%. If we use this concrete for the pillars, they won't hold even half the intended load." James studied the numbers, and his expression darkened. "Richard, I want you in my office in 1 hour, and I want a very good explanation for this." While waiting for the meeting, Jessica and Robert checked all the materials delivered that week. They discovered other unauthorized changes: thinner rebar, lower quality thermal insulation, even screws with different specifications than originally planned. "He's trying to make the project fail," Jessica concluded. But why? Robert grew thoughtful for a moment, piecing together a puzzle that had been forming in his mind for weeks. "Because if my plan succeeds, it'll prove he was wrong from the start," he explained. "And if it fails because of sabotage, he can say he always knew it wouldn't work." "That's terrible," Jessica said, outraged. "He's risking lives just to protect his own ego." The meeting in James's office lasted over 2 hours. When Richard emerged, he was pale and visibly shaken. James had confronted him not only about the changes, but also about a series of questionable decisions made throughout the project. "From now on," James announced to the entire team, "all technical specifications must be approved by me personally, and any changes require Mr. Roberts' signature as well." Richard was demoted from general coordinator to sector supervisor, a public humiliation that left him even more resentful. But now he no longer had the power to sabotage the project directly. With the obstacles removed, work progressed quickly. The drainage system functioned perfectly, the foundations were solid, and the structure began rising safely and steadily. Robert settled into a routine, arriving at the site at 6 in the morning, supervising each stage of the work, guiding the laborers, solving technical issues, and staying until late afternoon to ensure everything was executed as planned. Jessica brought him a change of fresh clothes and convinced him to get a haircut and shave at a nearby barbershop. When he returned, clean and well-groomed, some of the workers didn't recognize him at first. "You look like a new man," commented Frank, the foreman. "The competence was always there, but now the appearance matches." Robert smiled shyly. He had forgotten how good it felt to be respected, how important it was to have an appearance that reflected his inner dignity. During a coffee break, Jessica asked about his family. "Don't you think about reaching out to your daughter?" Robert fell silent for a long moment, absently stirring the sugar in his coffee. "I think about it every day," he finally admitted, "but I don't know if she'd want to see me. The last time we spoke, she said she was ashamed of me, that I had destroyed the family name." "But that was before you proved your innocence," Jessica insisted. "Now you have a way to show you've always been a competent and honest engineer." "Maybe," Robert sighed, "but some wounds are too deep to heal easily." That night, Jessica had an idea. She searched online and discovered that Robert's daughter, Emily Johnson Parker, was a pediatrician at a hospital in Milwaukee. On social media, she found photos of a beautiful 35-year-old woman with the same kind eyes as her father. Without telling Robert, Jessica sent Emily a message explaining the situation and attaching photos of the work her father was doing on the construction site. She didn't expect a reply, but 3 days later she got a call. "Hello, is this Jessica, the one who wrote to me about my father?" The voice was feminine, emotional. "Yes, it's me," Jessica answered, her heart racing. I didn't know he was working as an engineer again. I thought that he was completely lost." Jessica told the whole story, how Robert had shown up at the site, how he identified the problem, how he'd been humiliated and then recognized for his competence. Emily cried on the other end of the line. "I always knew my father was an honest man," she confessed. "But when everything fell apart, when he lost everything and started living on the streets, I didn't know how to help. I thought it was better to keep my distance to protect my own career." "He's different now," Jessica assured her. "He's regained his dignity, his confidence, but he still carries the pain of losing you. Do you think he'd forgive me for abandoning him when he needed me most?" "I'm sure he would," Jessica replied without hesitation. "He talks about you with so much love, so much pride. All he wants is a chance to be a father again." Emily promised she'd come to Chicago that weekend to see her father. Jessica was torn between joy at the impending reconciliation and nervousness about how Robert might react. Meanwhile, the construction was progressing smoothly. The 10th floor was being poured, and all the systems Robert had installed were working perfectly. James started talking about offers for other projects, about the possibility of Robert becoming a permanent consultant for the construction company. Richard, on the other hand, had become a fading presence on the site. His subordinates respected him less, the workers ignored his orders when they conflicted with Robert's, and even James had stopped including him in important meetings. That's when Jonathan Pierce showed up. Jessica recognized him immediately from the photos she'd seen online, a polished 50-year-old man with graying hair, an expensive suit, and an arrogant expression. He arrived in a silver Mercedes with 2 assistants, demanding to speak to the owner of the construction company. "James, we need to talk," he said, barging into the office without ceremony. "I've heard you're entrusting this project to a homeless man who lost his professional license." James received him coldly. He'd looked into Jonathan after discovering the irregularities in the original project and hadn't liked what he found. "Jonathan, I'm glad you're here. I actually wanted to talk to you about some omissions in your initial report on this land." Jonathan feigned surprise. "Omissions? I don't know what you're talking about. My report was thorough and accurate." "Then why didn't you mention the diverted water table? Why did you omit the drainage issues that have been documented since 2004? Jonathan hesitated for a moment, but quickly regained his confident expression. "Those are minor issues, easily addressed with modern construction techniques. There was no need to complicate the project with unnecessary details." "Unnecessary details?" James stood up, his voice filled with indignation. "We're talking about structural issues that nearly made my project collapse. And you're also talking about trusting a man who was responsible for a serious accident before." Jonathan fired back. "Do you know Robert Johnson had his license revoked after calculation errors that led to structural damage and injuries?" Jessica, who was present at the meeting, couldn't hold back. "We also know he was framed by someone who envied his competence," she said, looking Jonathan straight in the eye. Jonathan's face twisted into pure anger. "What kind of insinuation is that? I don't need to sit here listening to baseless accusations from an intern." "They're not baseless," James intervened, placing a folder with documents on the table. "I had the case from 20 years ago investigated. We found evidence of tampering with evidence, witness bribery, document forgery, and all the leads point to you." Jonathan paled, but tried to keep his composure. "That's all speculation. You have no concrete proof." "We have enough to reopen the case," James said with a cold smile, "and we have Robert's current work, which proves his professional competence beyond any doubt." Jonathan realized he was cornered. He looked around the room like a wounded animal searching for an escape. "You'll regret this," he threatened. "I have enough influence to destroy this construction company." "Your influence means nothing when we have the truth on our side," James replied calmly. "And I suggest you leave my office before I call security." Jonathan stormed out, but everyone knew the war was far from over. Men like him didn't accept defeat easily, and he would certainly try some form of retaliation. Robert learned about the visit just a few hours later, when Jessica told him everything. He took the news with surprising calm, as if he had expected this confrontation sooner or later. "He'll try something," he predicted. "Jonathan never accepted that I was a better engineer than him. That's what motivated the whole setup in the past." "But now you have support," Jessica reassured him. "James believes in you. The whole team recognizes your competence. Jonathan can't do anything." Robert smiled sadly. "You're very young, Jessica. Men like Jonathan have resources beyond what we can imagine. I have to be prepared for anything." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now continuing. That Friday, Robert's predictions came true. A surprise inspection showed up at the site, citing anonymous complaints about safety violations and structural issues. It was obvious Jonathan had used his connections to stir up trouble. The inspectors arrived with an extensive checklist, clearly prepared by someone who knew the technical details of the project. James personally oversaw the inspection alongside Robert, while Jessica coordinated the presentation of all requested documents. "This drainage system isn't in the original approved plans," noted the head inspector, a stern man with thick glasses. "Any structural modifications require new approval." "We have the complete documentation for the change here," Jessica responded, showing an organized folder, including the technical report justifying the need for the modification. The inspector examined the documents with excessive scrutiny, clearly looking for reasons to cause trouble. But Robert's work was impeccable. Every calculation was correct. Every specification met the standards. Every procedure was documented. After 6 hours of thorough inspection, the inspectors couldn't find any significant irregularities. The most they could issue was a minor fine for a missing sign on the 3rd floor. "The construction can continue," announced the lead inspector, visibly annoyed. "But we'll conduct another inspection in 2 weeks." When the inspectors left, the entire team celebrated. It was an important victory, showing that Robert's work could withstand the strictest scrutiny. "Jonathan must be furious," remarked Jessica, organizing the documents back into the folders. "And furious men make mistakes," observed James. "Let's keep working and let him expose himself." The weekend brought a surprise Robert wasn't expecting. Jessica had arranged to meet him Sunday morning to show some modifications to the 11th floor design, but she arrived accompanied by a woman he recognized immediately, even after 5 years apart. Emily looked more mature, with a few grey hairs she didn't have before, but her eyes were the same ones he remembered from childhood. She hesitated for a moment when she saw him, as if unsure how to approach. "Dad," she finally said, her voice choked with emotion. Robert felt his legs weaken. For a moment, he thought he might faint right there at the construction site entrance. All the pain, all the longing, all the anguish of the last few years condensed into that single word. "Dad." "Emily," he murmured, barely able to believe she was really there. "My girl." They embraced right there on the sidewalk, oblivious to the passing cars or curious onlookers. It was a hug 5 years in the making, 5 years of unspoken words, 5 years of a love that had never died, despite all the pain. "I'm sorry, Dad," Emily sobbed into his shoulder. "I'm sorry for doubting you, for leaving when you needed me most." "You don't have to apologize." Robert stroked her hair like he used to when she was little. "You did what you thought was right at the time, I understand." Jessica watched the scene with tears in her eyes, happy to have been the instrument of their reconciliation. She knew both father and daughter needed this moment, needed to heal the wounds time and pride had created. They spent the whole Sunday talking. Emily shared about her medical career, the husband she'd met during residency, and their plans to start a family. Robert spoke about the difficult years, how he'd hit rock bottom, and how this project had given him a second chance at life. "I'm so proud of you," Emily said, holding her father's hands. "Jessica told me everything you've done here, how you saved this project. I always knew you were a brilliant engineer." "And I always knew you'd be an exceptional doctor," Robert replied. "Even in the worst moments, you were always my greatest pride." That Monday, Robert arrived at the site transformed. It wasn't just the joy of reconciling with his daughter. It was a complete renewal of his self-esteem and confidence. He was a father again. He had a family again. He had reasons to build a better future. The construction had reached the 12th floor, and everything was running perfectly. The drainage system kept the ground stable, the foundations were solid, and the structure rose swiftly and safely. James began receiving praise from other builders who'd heard about the innovative project. It was in this moment of optimism that Jonathan Pierce made his last desperate move. He showed up at the site on a Wednesday morning with a court officer and a work stoppage order. "This construction must cease immediately," announced the officer, presenting the documents. "There's a legal challenge questioning the structural integrity of the project." James picked up the papers and quickly examined them. It was an injunction based on claims that the modifications to the original project had been made without the necessary approvals, putting public safety at risk. "This is a farce," James fumed. "All our modifications were approved by the proper authorities." "You can file the necessary appeals," the officer replied bureaucratically, "but until then, the construction is halted." Jonathan watched the scene with a poorly disguised smile of satisfaction. He had managed to stop the project, just as it was nearing the completion of the structure, causing massive losses and casting doubt on Robert's entire work. "It's a shame that trusting unqualified people too much can lead to these problems," he remarked to James, dripping irony with every word. Robert remained calm throughout the episode, but Jessica could see the tension in his eyes. He knew Jonathan too well not to realize this was just the beginning of a larger offensive. "What are we going to do?" Jessica asked when they were alone. "We'll fight," Robert answered firmly. "Jonathan thinks he can destroy me again, but this time I'm not alone. I have you, I have my daughter, I have my dignity back." The following days were a race against time. James mobilized his entire legal team to challenge the injunction, while Robert prepared additional technical documentation to prove the safety and legitimacy of all modifications. Jessica discovered that Jonathan had used a shell company to file the lawsuit, trying to hide his direct involvement. But her investigation uncovered a paper trail that clearly linked Jonathan to the sabotage attempt. "We have to expose him publicly," Jessica suggested during a meeting in James's office. "Show that this lawsuit is motivated by personal revenge, not legitimate safety concerns." "And how do we do that?" James asked. Robert thought for a moment. "We have to force him to reveal himself," he finally said. "Jonathan is too proud to resist the temptation to gloat if he thinks he's winning. The plan they devised was risky, but it could work." James organized a press conference for the local media, announcing that he would present evidence that the lawsuit was a sabotage attempt driven by personal interests. Jonathan couldn't resist the bait. He showed up at the press conference flanked by lawyers, ready to defend himself publicly, and seized the opportunity to attack Robert once more. It's unfortunate that a reputable construction company would place a $100 million project in the hands of a man who lost his professional license due to incompetence, he declared to the reporters. "My lawsuit is a matter of public responsibility." "Mr. Wilson," a reporter interrupted, "can you confirm you were responsible for the original design of this site in 2004? "Yes, I was the one who conducted the initial study," Jonathan replied proudly. "And were you aware of the drainage issues that existed on the site?" Jonathan hesitated. If he admitted he knew about the problems, he'd have to explain why he didn't include them in the design. If he denied it, he'd be contradicting his own documents. "Drainage issues are minor concerns that can be addressed during construction," he answered evasively. "Then why didn't you disclose them in the original design?" another journalist pressed. "And why are you specifically questioning the solutions that were implemented to fix those problems?" Jonathan began to sweat. He realized he'd walked into a trap, but didn't know how to escape without incriminating himself further. "My concern is safety," he repeated. "Structural modifications made by unqualified people pose unacceptable risks." That was when Robert stood up and approached the microphones. "I'd like to clarify a few things," he said firmly. "First, my professional qualifications have never been questioned on technical grounds. What happened 20 years ago was a setup, and we now have the proof. Second, all modifications made to this project were based on studies I conducted myself in 2004 as the original technical lead for this site." The room fell silent. Jonathan paled as he realized where Robert was heading. "Third," Robert continued, "I have here documents proving that Mr. Jonathan Pierce was fully aware of this site's drainage issues, but chose to omit them from the plans he sold to the construction company, putting the entire structure at risk." Robert handed copies of the original documents to the reporters. They were the 2004 studies, signed by him, but with handwritten notes from Jonathan acknowledging the problems and suggesting they be left for later to avoid complicating the sale. Jonathan tried to defend himself, but was clearly panicking. His explanations became muddled and contradictory, making it obvious to everyone he was hiding something. "The truth is simple," Robert concluded. "Mr. Jonathan Pierce tried to destroy me 20 years ago because he envied my professional competence. Now he's trying again because he can't stand seeing that I was right about this site's problems and he was wrong." The press conference ended with Jonathan rushing out, pursued by reporters demanding answers. James smiled, satisfied. Public opinion was clearly on their side now. The next day, the injunction was lifted. The judge ruled there was enough evidence that the lawsuit was motivated by personal interests, not legitimate safety concerns. Construction could resume immediately. Jonathan Pierce vanished from the scene after the public exposure. His reputation was ruined, and several of his other projects came under investigation for possible irregularities. Justice had finally caught up with the man who had destroyed Robert's life 2 decades earlier. With the project back on track, work continued with renewed enthusiasm. The crew took pride in their labor, knowing they were part of a project that had overcome every obstacle through competence and integrity. Robert became a respected figure, not just on site, but throughout Chicago's construction industry. Other builders sought his advice, and universities invited him to speak on professional ethics and technical expertise. Jessica graduated and was hired as a junior engineer at James's company, specifically assigned to projects overseen by Robert. Their partnership proved highly productive, combining his experience with her enthusiasm. James offered Robert a stake in the firm, recognizing his knowledge and reputation as valuable assets. Robert accepted on one condition: part of the profits would fund a vocational training program for people in vulnerable situations. "I want to give others the same opportunity you gave me," he explained at the contract signing. "There are so many talented people out there who just need a chance to prove themselves." The program was named Second Chance and became a model for other companies in the field. In its first year, it trained 15 professionals who had lost jobs due to prejudice or hardship. Emily moved back to Chicago to be closer to her father. She and her husband bought a house in the same neighborhood where Robert rented a modest but comfortable apartment. Family Sundays became sacred, with lunches that stretched into the afternoon as father and daughter made up for lost years. Richard Wilson was fired from the construction company a few months later, when it was proven that his sabotage attempt had put lives at risk. He found work at a smaller firm in a much lower position and learned the hard way that arrogance and prejudice come at a high cost. Frank Miller, the foreman, became one of the biggest advocates for the Second Chance program. He himself had grown up in tough conditions and knew how important it was to give opportunities to those who showed competence and dedication. "Robert taught me that the true measure of a man isn't in the clothes he wears or the place he lives," Frank would tell the new workers. "It's in the knowledge he carries and the honesty with which he works." The project was completed 6 months later, on time and within budget. The building became a landmark in Chicago's commercial architecture, not just for its beauty and functionality, but for the story of resilience and human dignity it represented. At the inauguration ceremony, Robert was invited to give a speech. He stepped onto the stage wearing a new but simple suit and looked out at the crowd of people who had once doubted him and were now applauding. "3 years ago," he began, "I slept on the street and was treated as invisible by society. Many of you here saw me only as a problem to be removed, not as a human being with knowledge and dignity." The room fell silent, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats. "I hold no grudges," Robert continued, "because I understand that prejudice comes from fear and ignorance, but I want this building to serve as a reminder that talent can be found anywhere, that competence has no fixed address, and that human dignity must be respected regardless of circumstances." The applause was warm and prolonged. Jessica wept with emotion, James smiled proudly, and Emily held her husband's hand, beaming with happiness at seeing her father publicly recognized. "This project," Robert concluded, "was only possible because a few people had the courage to look beyond appearances and recognize others' worth. Jessica, who believed in me when no one else did. James, who had the humility to admit he was wrong and the wisdom to trust in competence. Frank and all the workers who treated me as an equal. And my daughter Emily, who forgave me and gave me back the most important thing in my life, family love." As he stepped off the stage, Robert was surrounded by people eager to congratulate him, ask about his future projects, or simply express admiration for his story of resilience. In the crowd, he spotted familiar faces from his hardest days, homeless individuals who had followed his journey from afar, shelter staff who had known him, ordinary people who understood the value of a second chance when it came. Professor Robert, a young man called out timidly as he approached. "I'm Tyler, an engineering student. I've been watching the construction work every day. Could you give me some advice on how to become a good engineer?" Robert smiled and placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. "Study hard, work with honesty, and never forget that engineering is about serving people," he replied. "And above all, never judge anyone by appearances. Knowledge can be found where you least expect it." The celebration lasted well into the night, but Robert left early. He wanted to visit the spot where he used to sleep, where he had endured the worst moments of his life. Not out of nostalgia, but to remember where he had come from and appreciate how far he had come. Jessica found him standing in front of the overpass, watching the movement of the city that never slept. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "I'm thinking about life's little ironies," Robert replied. "The place that almost destroyed me ended up being the place where I found my salvation. If I hadn't been here that March morning, I might never have spotted the issue at the construction site. And maybe I'd never have learned that true competence comes from life experience, not just diplomas," Jessica added. They stood there for a few minutes in silence, watching the city lights and reflecting on the strange paths life sometimes takes. "Jessica," Robert finally said, "thank you for believing in me when I'd stopped believing in myself. Thank you for teaching me that engineering is so much more than calculations and formulas," she replied. "It's about responsibility, dignity, and serving others." 2 years later, Robert Johnson's story became the subject of a documentary, a book, and even a movie. But he continued living simply, working on his projects, overseeing the Second Chance program, and cherishing every moment with his daughter and grandchildren. James Thompson's construction company became one of the most respected in Chicago, known not just for the technical quality of its projects, but for its social responsibility and respect for human rights. The Johnson method, as it came to be known, was adopted by other companies across the country. Jessica became a renowned engineer, specializing in social and sustainable projects. She always credited her humanistic approach to Robert's teachings, which showed her that technology should serve to improve people's lives, not just generate profits. Frank Miller retired a few years later, but continued volunteering with the Second Chance program, teaching construction trades to people seeking a fresh start in life. Richard Wilson never fully recovered from the blow to his career. He worked at smaller firms until taking early retirement, forever carrying the bitter lesson that prejudice and arrogance come at a high cost. Jonathan Pierce vanished from the professional scene after the scandal. Some said he'd moved to another state, others that he'd emigrated abroad. Wherever he was, his reputation was ruined forever. The building constructed under Robert's supervision became a symbol of resilience and triumph. A plaque at the entrance honored all the workers who had contributed to the project, with special recognition for those who proved that talent has no address and dignity has no price. Emily Johnson Parker had 2 children, who grew up hearing their grandfather's stories about perseverance, honesty, and second chances. They learned early on that a person's worth isn't measured by what they own, but by the character they show. In his lectures to engineering students, Robert always ended with the same thought: life will test you in ways you can't imagine. You'll face injustice, prejudice, and defeats that'll seem final. But always remember, your competence is your true wealth, your honesty is your real strength, and your ability to start over is your greatest victory. Many years later, when he was an elderly and respected man, Robert still walked the streets of Chicago, observing construction sites. He'd stop to chat with workers, offer advice to young engineers, and always carried the humility of someone who'd seen both sides of life. On one of these walks, he spotted a younger man sleeping near a construction site, his clothes dirty and his appearance ragged. Robert approached carefully and noticed some sheets of paper with technical drawings beside him. "Excuse me," said Robert kindly. "Do you know anything about construction?" The man looked at him warily, like someone who'd been turned away from many places before. "A little," he replied cautiously. "Why?" Robert smiled and sat down beside him on the sidewalk. "Because maybe I can help. My name's Robert Johnson, and I've slept on the streets too. But I've learned there's always a second chance for those with skill and determination." The man's eyes lit up with a spark of hope. And right there on that sidewalk, a new story of resilience began, a new cycle of opportunities, another proof that human dignity can blossom in the most unexpected places. End of story. And what about you, dear listener? What did you think of this story of resilience and second chances? Have you ever faced tough times that tested your faith in life? Do you know someone who had to start over from scratch? Share your thoughts about Robert's story in the comments. Leave a like if this narrative moved you. And most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other touching stories we bring to you. Your engagement is what keeps us sharing these heartfelt tales.